Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And today I just wanted to quickly talk about another one of the shortlists from the Writers' Prize, which is sort of a renaming or relaunch of what was formerly the Rathbones Folio Prize. The difficult thing with sponsors for prizes is that essentially if they change, the name of the prize can often change. So what was sort of the Folio Prize and then the Rathbones Folio started becoming a bit more complicated. And the Writers' Prize is a good, steady name that hopefully won't have to change much. And the whole kind of idea within the prize is that these are books selected by a sort of specific community of writers. And so the lists often come with some quite unexpected ones because these may be books that didn't necessarily make a splash in sales or what have you, but kind of appear in other ways. Anyway, this is the poetry category, and I'll sort of say right off the jump, poetry is something that I really enjoy reading. I often find it complicated to talk about because I don't always necessarily know if I have the same level of ability to talk about it. But at the same time, I like talking about it. So let's give this a go. And also, you know, part of poetry should be that it's accessible enough to be able to read it and say, I don't quite know what I read, but I enjoyed this, this, and this. So anyway, let's go. So the fun thing with going alphabetically with this set of poets is that they spell out the letters ABC. So let's start with A, where we have Jason Allen-Paisant, who has his collection Self-Portrait as Othello. And this is a really exciting and interesting collection, I think, in many, many ways. I spoke about it recently in a weekly reads video, but essentially the core idea of this book is sort of looking at the Shakespearean character of Othello as this sort of othered figure, this one sort of lone black man, often in a sea of people who don't look like him. And in the play of his name, he is this sort of quite complicated character because he is both often welcomed and loved by some of the people around him in various guises, but also really despised and really hated. And he sits very uncomfortably as this figure of somebody who both defies some of the stereotypes around him, but also kind of creates these other new ways of being. And for people in the play, that can be quite uncomfortable. And so sort of through using Othello as his central sort of muse almost, or the central kind of trope or theme in this poetry collection, I found it really interesting what Jason Allen-Paisant is able to do, because he takes kind of this idea of being a person of multiple places, or sort of almost a person who has no one fixed place that they can call their own, and kind of uses Othello to probe into that a bit more deeply. So he looks, for example, at the fact that he himself is a man who has Senegalese family. He speaks French. He lives in Italy and in France for a bit. He lives in other places. He lives in bits of the US. He moves around and has this this sort of life that is in many ways very like Othello. And he uses that to really probe these deeper questions about what it means to be accepted or folded in to people around you, but also what does it mean if you don't fit a comfortable view for somebody in their mind of what it is to be from that place. He also talks, you know, these moments where he'll talk to people who share quite a lot with him, but he sort of feels strange, like, you know, it's maybe someone who is sort of working class, but from one of the same countries as him. You know, sort of, I think he meets someone who's Senegalese at one point and he's talking to them, and there's this sort of odd interaction of him sort of being like, well, there's a lot that we do have in common and we can have that shared thing, but also right now you're in a, you know, I'm buying a service from you. And so there's this kind of complicated dynamic. So I think he explores quite a lot in very small amounts of space in this collection. I just think it's really quite staggering. Next up, I read The Home Child by Liz Berry, and this is a really interesting collection in a lot of ways. So again, mentioned it in a recent weekly reads. It takes as the core idea, there was this sort of movement of people in sort of between 1860 and 1960, where about 100,000 children were moved from the UK to Canada. And these were often children who were in the care system, who were orphans who had some kind of, they were sort of institutionalized almost in some way, like that. And so this was, you know, a kind of program that ostensibly was to sort of, solve this problem. And I hate it being seen as a problem, but you know what I mean. At least from the government side, this was sort of, what do we do with these children? And so they were sent, and Liz Berry has sort of family connection to it with her grandmother, and so she writes really lovingly about imagining what it was like through her eyes. But this book, this kind of poetry collection, reads almost like a novel with this kind of narrative aspect, and she guides us through essentially this journey, these sets of children, their ages, what they do, what they like, what they're interested in, their fears, how it feels when they first arrive, the kinds of bonds that they try to make and how they struggle. And I think it avoids quite a lot of the typical tropes of, we don't get poem upon poem of like, oh, it's a bit weird and different in Canada. Like, we don't get that, which I'm actually quite grateful for, because I think it allows us to really focus on the wider human story of this. We see sort of letters and labels of almost like school reports of somebody saying, oh, this child, Hilda, is, seems, like a nice child, very quiet and pleasant, sometimes a bit shy. And it's sort of these reports that are written almost in this cold way of, why are these children not doing more when they've just been shipped, across an ocean? There's something really quite compelling, I think, in the way that she tells this very personal and very real story, but through poetry and through a kind of allowing narratives to sort of come out of that. And towards the end of the collection, we see a young girl falling sort of in love or lust with a young boy. And she is just really quite tender because of the way that she's able to pull together the real joys of that, but also the absolute terror that comes with it. And actually, without spoiling anything, the end part of this book looks back in a really meaningful and beautiful way that I just thought was really quite stunning. And last but definitely not least, Mary Jean Chan with Bright Fear. I absolutely adored her last collection, Flesh, which I just think is staggering in so many ways. And Bright Fear, I think, really builds on that in a really interesting way. It still does a lot of exploration around identity, particularly through race and nationality. So Mary Jean Chan being from Hong Kong, there's a kind of complicated sense of nationhood, not only because of sort of China versus Hong Kong, but also Hong Kong and its sort of British history and of sort of occupation and sort of colonialism, but the way that, Hong Kongers were offered British passports, these kinds of things. So she talks about all of that, but during the time of COVID, when obviously sort of there was a horrible rise in anti-Asian hate crime, and there was a real feeling and sort of view that, Asian people were to blame or whatever. So she looks at that, but she also particularly looks at those little moments of panic and terror and fear that infiltrated how we operated in our day-to-day lives. So the ways that sudden things like human contact suddenly became this sort of dangerous thing, or the ways that we suddenly viewed other people as potential threats because of the virus or whatever. And so she builds this really deeply lyrical and thoughtful set of poems around these core ideas. And there's something so staggering in the way that she's able to capture that this is, again, it avoids all these basic easy tropes of it was sad and we had to stay inside a lot, which sometimes comes out from some of the writing now on the pandemic or on lockdown, which can sometimes feel a bit trite in my mind and a bit kind of overdone. And I think actually she really explores the depths of this sort of human psyche around fear and terror and what that looks like, but is also able to thread in these other fascinating thoughts. I think this is the thing I've really enjoyed about the two collections of hers I've read so far, is she takes one central idea and so many things spin off of it that at first seem quite disparate, but seem to find their way back into this core argument and idea. I just think she's incredible. So yeah, this is a brilliant collection. And so all of that those are the three books. I really adored all three books, I think, as you can probably tell. I think this is a fantastic shortlist of poetry collections. read all of them if you've got the chance. But in terms of my own personal winner, it's a hard one. I'd probably say either Bright Fear or maybe Self-Portrait as Othello. But honestly, The Home Child is gorgeous as well. So whatever floats your boat. I think it's just a fascinating set of poems, poetry collections, and I'm really glad that I was encouraged to read it by the prize. This is why I like prizes, because I think things like this are books that I otherwise wouldn't have picked up for a while, particularly these two, which I have been sort of skirting around. Bright Fear I'd read before the shortlist. But yeah, wonderful, wonderful books. Anyway, I hope you're doing really well. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.